Good evening. Thank you for joining us. You have found the Empower Our Future Empower Hour. Tonight, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Peter Lilienthal, who will be giving us an informed review of the CEO, which is the Colorado Energy Office Microgrid Roadmap. So you're going to get some information tonight about this Microgrid Roadmap. Then the Colorado Energy Office is hoping to get your input, and those sessions are coming up next week. So you can see the dates there on the 22nd, the Western Slope and Eastern Plains. Front Range folks can weigh in on the 23rd. And again, you'll want to go to that website for more details and to sign up for those input sessions or to provide written comment. So before we get much farther along, I'm going to go ahead and do the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge with respect as non-native people that the land on which we stand, live, and learn is the traditional territory of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples. We also recognize the 48 contemporary tribal nations that are historically tied to the lands that make up the state of Colorado. We honor elders past, present, and future, and those who have stewarded this land throughout generations. We also recognize that our government, academic, and cultural institutions and our nation itself were founded upon and continue to enact exclusions and erasures of Indigenous peoples. May this acknowledgement demonstrate a commitment to working to dismantle ongoing legacies of settler colonialism, oppression, and inequities, and to recognize the hundreds of Indigenous nations who continue to resist, live, create, and uphold their sacred relations across their lands. Let us seek to understand what it means to be in right relationship today with the traditional stewards of this land and with this land itself and all the creatures that inhabit it. And so without further ado, I would like to go ahead and introduce our guest speaker tonight. Dr. Peter Lilienthal is the Global Microgrid Lead for Clean Power Everywhere. That, I believe, is a relatively new announcement, and he can tell you more about that, perhaps in his comments. Peter is also a member of the advisory panel for the City of Boulder's partnership with Xcel Energy, and he will be giving us his informed opinion this evening of the recently released Colorado Energy Office Microgrid Roadmap. Peter was previously the CEO of Homer Energy. Since 1992, he has been the developer of the National Renewable Energy Lab's Homer hybrid power optimization software, which has been used by over 250,000 energy practitioners in 193 countries. Dr. Lilienthal was a senior economist with international programs at NREL from 1990 to 2007. He was one of the creators of NREL's International and Village Power programs. He has a Ph.D. in Management Science and Engineering from Stanford University. He's been active in the field of renewable energy and energy efficiency since 1978. This has included designing and teaching courses at the university level, project development, and power projects, and consulting to consulting to industry and regulators. His expertise is in the economic and financial analysis of renewable and microgrid and hybrid power projects. Thank you, Peter, so much for joining us. I'm going to hand it over to you if you want to. Thanks.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you all for attending. First, I want to say a little bit about the Colorado Energy Office and Office of Local Affairs, I think it's called, worked together on this. And they gave a presentation a week or two ago, which is on their website now. They recorded the webinar and they have a slide deck there. you just want a review of the roadmap they put together, I recommend watching their webinar and looking at their slide deck. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a little bit of a review, but I'm also going to give my take on it, because I've been working on microgrids for over 30 years, as Mary said, starting back at NREL in 1992. As an outgrowth of the Earth Summit in Rio, we created the Village Power Program to help developing countries use renewable energy. And nobody called them microgrids then. Some people called them mini grids, but that was the logical way to provide power to it. At the time, it was like 2 billion people that didn't have access to power. We still have something like 700 million people in the world who simply don't have to walk 10 miles to get their cell phone charged. So at NREL, it's still a research project. It really wasn't economic at that time. We worked on the developing the technology to do that, and part of that was creating the software, the Homer software, for figuring out, what made sense from an economic perspective. That's what kicked this all off, and that was 1992. Started slowly, but it's really accelerated since then. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what is the microgrid, what's the current state of the technology and the markets, and then I'll get into the Colorado roadmap and what's in it. So that's what I'm planning to do. But I thought it'd be useful to talk a little bit about what is a microgrid, because there's a lot of different definitions out there. Frankly, I think it's very simple. It's a power system that can stand on its own. The only thing that's a little tricky about that definition is it doesn't mention size at all, because they come in all different sizes. From a cabin in the woods is a microgrid. I resist calling that a nanogrid or a picogrid. This is confusing enough. On the large side, islands are typically microgrids, but if you get a big enough island, well, then it's sort of silly to call it a microgrid. So my cutoff is, are they big enough to use sort of traditional utility scale technology, the traditional ones like coal fire plants or combined cycle natural gas plants. So remote areas typically aren't going to have access to natural gas anyway. So something just to scale this for you, take Hawaii, for example. The islands of Maui and Kauai and the Big Island, those I consider them microgrids. Oahu is a much bigger grid. It's like 1,000 megawatts. So I don't consider that a microgrid. I talked to someone who said, "Well, I'm from Ireland's a small island." I go, "No, Ireland's not a small island." But anyway, so my way of categorizing microgrids is energy access, the places where this is the only way you're going to get power, where there's no existing infrastructure, islands or islanded power systems, and grid-connected microgrids, which is really the focus of the Colorado study. But I want to set the stage for it a little bit by talking about how we got here. So the original microgrids were these remote microgrids, and as I said before, there's still 700 million people in the world who need microgrids to have 24-hour AC power. And so that category is where there's no existing infrastructure. There'd typically be smaller systems, and they need some institutional development. They need someone to maintain. It's a bigger challenge. It's not just a technical challenge. But it's really starting to happen now. It's exciting, I think. And I distinguish that from what I call islanded power systems, where there already is a power system, but it's diesel, typically diesel powered, and we don't often think of diesel as a utility technology, but there's tens of thousands of these diesel powered utilities around the world. There's something like 230 of them in Alaska alone. Canada has even more. And then when you start getting into it, you realize there are a lot of inhabited islands in the world. I mean, Indonesia alone has several thousand, and the Philippines and the Caribbean and Greece and the Pacific has hundreds and maybe thousands and some of them are tiny, but some of them aren't. So it's a fascinating area. And the reason I make a big point about it is because they were the pioneers. They developed, that's where this technology developed. And they're going to high penetrations of renewables much more rapidly. So there are examples of islands now in the world that are 97% renewable. Kodiak, Alaska is a pretty big island, frankly. It's got the largest Coast Guard station in the US. It's where Deadliest Catch was filmed, actually. That's 97, 95, 98. I don't know. It's almost entirely renewable. I am not sharing my screen, but fortunately you haven't missed much yet. This is all you missed. So you didn't miss much. There, you missed the title slide. You can read that really quickly. You can read that pretty quickly. And here, I was on this slide. So I was talking about high renewable penetration, and Xcel's really proud to get to like 30%, and they're moving beyond that. And for a really big utility, that actually is pretty good. But for these smaller utilities like Kodiak, Alaska, but there's lots of examples now of islands and small microgrids that are primarily renewables. And so they were also pioneers on how to integrate batteries into a power system. And that's a huge topic. Load management, prioritizing your loads, looking at your loads and going, well, now some of these are not just curtailable because they're not a priority, but also controllable or deferrable. So any kind of water treatment, water pumping, water heating is a good example. Actually, the best example now are electric vehicles. You are inherently getting some flexibility on when to charge an electric vehicle. And then there's a real technical issue, which I won't go into a lot of detail, but typical old-fashioned, if you will, power technologies had a lot of rotating equipment, generators spinning, and it's got some inertia or momentum built into just naturally, mechanically in the system. And that is actually really helpful for keeping things stable. But if you don't have a generator spinning and you're relying just on power electronics, the inverter, battery, PV, et cetera, there's stability issues and there's solvable issues, but it's new and different. And so it's that the technology and the techniques for stabilizing the system that's just using inverters took some development, and we're there now, but it's because of the work done on remote microgrids that we've really learned how to do what's called grid forming inverters. There's technical issues about fault currents and inertia that I'm not going to go into a lot of details here, but it's a significant issue that has been solved. But everything changed with Sandy. Suddenly, microgrids became the topic of real importance in the lower 48. And when you have an outage like Sandy, that's regional and it's multi-day, suddenly everyone started realizing, well, wait a minute, it's not just hospitals that need backup generation. It's not, it's what is your critical infrastructure? In that situation, grocery stores and gas stations become critical infrastructure. And diesel generators need, typically have maybe a day's worth of fuel stored on site. So if it's just a small outage or a short outage, okay, that works. But in a situation like Sandy, there aren't enough fuel trucks to keep those generators running, and the roads might be in bad shape. So suddenly people realized, distributed generation has real value here for resilience, and the problem's getting worse. So as they had a nice slide on the roadmap about that. So now I'm going to talk about grid connected microgrids. That's the third category. Energy access was one. Islanded systems, I think they're worth thinking about differently. And grid connected microgrids are definitely different, but they rely on a lot of the same technologies and learning and expertise and experience that has been developed in remote microgrids. So the roadmap categorized them differently because they're just focusing on the grid connected ones. And so they made a distinction between an individual building microgrid. It has a single point of connection, single customer, keeps things simple, a campus like CU, but an industrial park, a military base, and that's been a real entry market for microgrids, the military bases, but also UC, one of the first, but Princeton kept its lights on during Sandy because it had a microgrid, and now there's dozens of universities that can do that. The name of the third category called the community microgrid, which I don't think, which barely exists yet because there's all kinds of legal and regulatory issues where where now you've got multiple customers. The advantage of a campus is it's all one owner, one customer. You're not selling power to somebody else. That introduces all kinds of legal and regulatory issues. You're not crossing right of ways, which is also creates all kinds of legal and regulatory issues. So campuses don't have that issue. That issue I don't think has been properly solved yet for the most part. So there's a couple of community microgrids, mostly utility owned, because they don't have to worry about, they're already a utility company, right? And I saw a great example in Chattanooga and one, and in the Tampa Bay area, which I don't have time to go into. But anyway, that's the categorization they used. And then they also so we're thinking about 3 different value propositions. I created a triangle like this 15 years ago, except I called it, instead of sustainability, I called it environmental benefits because just a little more precise. I think sustainability can mean a lot of different things, but really these are 3 distinct value propositions for microgrids. Sustainability is the resilient is the resilience is the one I'm going to talk about most. Environmental benefits are, if you're doing renewables, you're reducing carbon emissions. So that's and other emissions too. So that's the environmental benefit. Cost savings. The roadmap makes a big point about how Colorado's energy costs are below the national average a little bit. And unlike a place like California or these islands or Alaska or Hawaii, where the power is really, really expensive, and these microgrids make sense just strictly on economics, here in Colorado, the value prop, the position that really matters is the resilience. Who needs to have super reliable power, and that can be worth a lot. So it's not just about saving on your utility bill; it's also reducing the cost of outages, which varies dramatically depending on the facility and what they're doing with energy. So that we'll talk more about that in a minute. They also broke the resilience down into these 3 categories. T&D infrastructure basically is the transmission and distribution system kind of aging. I've got a map of Colorado's system in another slide, and you'll see that there are some inherent vulnerabilities there. Climate, is getting worse, and that's actually what causes most of the outages. Sometimes a contractor will run over I will dig up an underground line, or a car will crash into a telephone pole or something. But for the most part, it's climate related. And then they talked a lot about social vulnerabilities, which is a totally different topic, but it's an interesting one, because if you've got someone on the dialysis machine, they're really vulnerable, and they really need high reliability power. Or you have nursing home, for example, or you have people who don't have transportation, and if the power goes out and it's 100 degrees and they need to get to an evacuation center, or wildfire, they need to get to an evacuation center, whatever. That's a social vulnerability that they actually put a lot of emphasis on. So here's that map of the transmission system that I mentioned. And there's a couple of things worth pointing out here. So I don't know if you see my mouse or not, but there's a lot of lines here that are what they call long radial lines. There's just one line going out to a community, and if anything happens on that line, that community loses, the whole thing loses power. As opposed to most of the state, especially the Front Range, you've got multiple lines forming loops, and if there's an outage, if the line breaks in one place, you can localize the outage and move power around. But the worst example here down here in the San Luis Valley, and even though there's multiple transmission lines, they're all going through the same Poncha Pass. And so something happened in Poncha Pass, this entire San Luis Valley loses power. But you can see there's a whole bunch of these lines that just go off on their own into the more rural areas. And so that's they put some effort into, they put some effort into identifying where the most vulnerable areas are. And I'll show that in a minute. But let me talk about the weather issue, because this map really surprised me. Colorado is one of the 4 or 5 worst states in the nation for disaster cost per capita. So California has worse wildfires, Florida has worse weather, but there are much more people. On a per capita basis, Colorado is one of the 4 or 5 worst ones in the country. So that actually surprised me. So I put it up there. And this, I think, is a really dramatic demonstration of what the problem of how much worse these disasters really started ramping up around 2000 and then started ramping up even faster around 2011 or so. So this has become a big issue, which before it really wasn't. So I thought this slide was really meaningful. And so when we look within the state, there's huge variation in the reliability. So SATA is a utility metric for the average minutes of interruption of outages or interruptions per year across per customer. And you can see Fort Collins is the clear winner, but the whole Front Range is quite reliable compared to, well, the San Luis Valley and the southeast area and the northwest area. The more rural areas of the state have, many times less reliable power, like 30 or 40 times more outage minutes. So the roadmap was useful for me in just terms of getting data like this. It's more of a primer, I have to say, on what is the microgrid and what do you need to know and think about, as opposed to, so that's like a map that shows you where everything is, as opposed to a map that says, okay, first we're going to go to this town and then we're going to the next town, exactly what we're going to do. This lays out lots of options. So this is the map I mentioned with showing the regions that they thought were particularly vulnerable that they should focus on. And I'm not going to go into this in detail, but it's all in the roadmap. You can look, because each one of them has a slightly different reason for being in the being considered a vulnerable region. So one thing that's really important when you're thinking about microgrids is identifying critical facilities, because if you're talking about being able to keep the power on for multiple days without fuel deliveries, you may have to limit it to the critical facilities or critical loads within a facility, just to extend the life of the batteries or extend the life of the fuel tank for that matter. So and also prioritizing where to put microgrids. So wastewater treatments. I mean, when there was the public safety power shutoff for the wildfire a month or two ago, there was some concern about the wastewater treatment facility that needs to have reliable power. We've always known hospitals need reliable power, and they've always had backup generators that just sit there most of the time. Whereas if you have a microgrid, you've got something that's generating value all the time as well. Police stations, of course, the power facilities, of course. And like I mentioned before, in an extended outage, grocery stores and pharmacies and gas stations become critical infrastructure. I would put the communication right up at the top, and they're typically not huge power loads either, actually. And then recreation centers and schools, et cetera, can be great evacuation centers. So this all needs to be thought through. Every community is going to be a little different. And also, it's really worth thinking about, are we talking, what do we do if in an outage it's 1 hour? What kind of costs or problems does that create? And for some places that might not be a problem, but for other places, like the police station, for example, or the wastewater treatment facility, even an hour, or some manufacturing facilities, even small glitches in the power can ruin a batch of, if they're of semiconductors, or plastic extrusion, or I heard talk to a Coca-Cola bottling company, and they said when in Haiti the power is horrible, and when the power went bad, bottles went flying off the their assembly line. So but the needs for a 1 hour outage are really different. And for a 1 day outage, right now I'm working with a microgrid developer who's focusing on food distribution, warehouses of refrigerated food, and they want to electrify their delivery fleet. And so they need a microgrid for this, both to protect their refrigerated, millions of dollars worth of refrigerated inventory and freezers and stuff, but also the electric vehicles. It isn't talked about as much as you might expect in the roadmap, but it's a real challenge. Powering these fast chargers require huge amounts of power, and in most places that would require a distribution upgrade of some kind, either a substation or the feeder or a transformer, some distribution upgrade. And those take time. Those are expensive, and it's, you got to get in the queue, and there's permitting issues, and that is expensive, but more importantly, a very time-consuming challenge to upgrade distribution systems. And so you can actually develop a microgrid faster than you can upgrade a distribution system in a lot of cases. And that's going to be necessary for a lot of fast charging, especially a distribution depot that's going to have lots of fast chargers for lots of big trucks. So that's something I'm actually working on at the moment. So moving on, another thing that I thought what I thought was one of the more interesting aspects of the roadmap was developing this process for prioritizing these critical facilities. I'm not really a process guy myself, to be honest. But so it's useful to have someone else think through that. Well, it's not one person's going to make these decisions. You need a whole committee. You need to get input from a lot of people about what's considered critical in that community. They need to be educated. The roadmap talks a lot about education, collecting background information. They need to, okay, what are the critical facilities? How do we prioritize them? What are they currently doing, if anything? And then there's the whole planning process or investigation of solutions. So that's thinking through the steps. Is something that every community needs to start doing, and this is a good way to think about that. So what are the barriers to microgrids? Well, there's technical barriers. They're mostly solvable, but people need to understand them. I mentioned a little bit about um, stability issues, but there's also interconnection issues, etc. Financial issues. These are capital intensive. They're costly projects. But the biggest barriers really are these legal and regulatory issues. Permitting is a huge issue. Interconnection standards are a huge issue. And this crazy one about crossing rights of way is a total showstopper in a lot of cases. And the solution to that has to be through legal and regulatory issues. So they came up with a big long list of potential policies, and I'm not going to list all of them, but I've highlighted in red just the ones, in my opinion, that are most important. And the interconnection, I highlighted it twice, but they mention it in two different ways. This ancillary service thing, again, quite technical, but there's a huge opportunity and it's happening in other parts of the country where there's a where the utility system's been deregulated a little bit. There's a regional transmission organization or independent system operator where microgrids and other projects really can bid into markets to provide things like spinning reserve and frequency regulation, et cetera. That's what's called ancillary services, but it's a very profitable thing for these project developers, and it would really help microgrids. Colorado not being deregulated hasn't really developed that yet. So that's not really happening yet here, but it could. The whole, this one about ownership structures and legal treatment rights of way, I've already mentioned it a few times. It's huge. And permitting is these things really slow down, not just slow down projects, but also add costs and can make projects uncost effective, where just looking at the technology, you go, well, this makes sense, but then you realize, oh, but I got to hire lawyers forever and spend huge amounts of money on legal issues and permitting issues, and that can totally destroy the economics of a project. So streamlining all that stuff is super important. So they created a sort of a phased approach, and theirs is a little more complicated. I've simplified it a little bit into basically 3 phases. What this is, established core structural elements. And again, the permitting and the legal issues are right dead, first thing on the line. And then this education, making sure, because this is a new thing, people don't really know enough about it. And then policy and regulatory support. And the way I simplified this was those last 3 issues: interconnection issues, tariffs, and ancillary services. In the roadmap, those show up in multiple places because it's not a simple thing to just, it's a one-time fix. It's a whole process. So I pulled them out. So they sort of cover, they should be part of all 3 phases, I guess the best way to say that. So that's the phased approach. So I'm going to wrap it up there, but I really do, if you're interested in this, the presentation, the webinar they gave was excellent. The slides they gave were better than my slides. I think you should go, that's where you'll get the best information on the roadmap. I was just sort of giving you my take on it. And as Mary said before, next week, there will be these stakeholder meetings. So that's worth, they want input from the public on that. There's actually a survey that on that same, that way you can access it on that same website mentioned at the top there. So you can put in some written comments. And I might also mention that here in Boulder is a totally unique community in terms of the density of clean energy people of all different kinds. But also the trade association for microgrids is Think Microgrid, is run by Cameron Brooks, who lives here in Boulder. So we're sort of a nexus for this kind of thinking: microgrids, distributed generation more generally, renewable energy more generally, but especially microgrids. That's where I had my business, and there's others. So I definitely think Microgrid does a great job of reviewing the policy landscape across the country. And I'm going to leave it there, and I gather there's some questions and answers, so stick around for those.
Thank you very much, Peter. I'm Chris Hoffman with Empower Our Future, and want to thank you from everybody who's attended this. And we have about 30 people online in addition to the panelists, and more people will be able to see this when we post the video online on our website, which should happen in a couple of days. One of the questions, first question is, are there copies of the slides available? And I know they will be available through the video that we post online. But Peter, are your slides, can you make your slides available for us?
Yeah, but I'll work with you or somebody to, I'm not sure what the best way to do that is, but I'm happy to do that.
Work with us afterwards. Okay, well, we've got a lot of questions in the Q&A.
I might point out that the slides is to keep them sparse so that people listen instead of reading.
Yes.
The slides that the Colorado Energy office put together are denser, have a lot more information on them. So if you want slides, those are great slides, but I'll make my slides available too.
Thank you. And it does sound like we have the information for the Colorado Energy Office for the roadmap and the second round of stakeholder meetings and the survey on microgrids. All of that is available. You can see all the links. Peter has put those up on the slide, and it sounds like you're strongly recommending people participate in these stakeholder meetings and send input in. And so we'll get to the questions now. First one is, this seems to be a top-down approach for deploying microgrids. Are there any known examples for microgrids being built from a bottom-up approach?
Well, I think that's an astute observation, actually. It feels like Xcel had a lot of, and the PUC, et cetera, and had a lot of input, and the PUC is really focused on the two investor-owned utilities in the state, and so there are the remote microgrids that I was talking about is definitely bottoms up, but there are some microgrid developers here in Colorado who two that I know in Fort Collins, Spire and Agito, and we had back when I had Homer Energy, we had a newsletter, Microgrid News, and we highlighted a couple of interesting projects that I should have mentioned. But one of them was a car dealership in Greeley, and I apologize, I don't remember which one it is. But they, after getting a bunch of hail damage, they wanted to put up solar carports, and Agito actually helped, and well, several suppliers, including Agito, created a microgrid there for them, and so I think you'd call that a bottoms-up development. The roadmap was sponsored by the Colorado Energy Office, which was part of the state of Colorado. So that's why it's not surprising that it sort of had a top-down approach to it, and getting some of these policy obstacles out of the way would help the people doing bottoms-up stuff. So I don't think they're sort of. I don't think the distinction is crisp between the two types, but
and maybe not mutually exclusive.
Right.
We have a comment from Tracy Burnett, who was the prime sponsor for the legislation that got this done.
Oh, good for you. Thank you.
And we're happy that she's online here. She says, I was hoping there would be more specific recommendations about rights of way, legal barriers, and how to streamline permitting. Any comments about that?
Yeah, no, I was trying to be diplomatic, but I kind of agree that, and that's why I was saying, well, what is a roadmap? I was thinking a roadmap is, okay, we're going to do this first and this second, and we're going to do these specific things like laying out. Okay, here's the trip we're going to take, and I don't think that's what it is actually. But you could also think a roadmap is just, you have a map and it shows all the different stuff, and then it doesn't tell you what to do. It's just lays out a lot of options. So I do think we need to get more specific about, okay, there's all these different things we could do, but what should we do first? And I think that's a legitimate, more than legitimate. I had the same impression reading it, that it'd be nice if it recommended stuff.
So it sounds like it gives us the lay of the land and does a good job at that, but doesn't show us a route. It's not a route map. It's just an overall map.
Yeah, right. A route map. That's probably the term I should have used. It's a map, but not a route map. Yeah.
So do you think we can expect a route map after this next round?
I didn't have anything to do with the development of it, so I don't know what to expect, but
but it sounds like you're hoping for it.
Yeah, I think we should. I think we should have. Yes.
Okay. So here's another question. what are the best examples of policies that Colorado could use to move microgrids forward in Colorado?
Well, this is where I put in a pitch for a Think Microgrid at the end, because they do a great job of going across the states and saying what states have done what. And the roadmap actually does give some examples of some things that and I don't remember them all. But Maine did something about the rights of way issue. What's the status of that? I don't know, but they're working on that. There's a couple of California's doing all kinds of different things. Some mostly good, some not so good, but they do all kinds of things. New York's a real leader. And I'm sorry I can't give many specific examples. The roadmap has some. I think Microgrid has some. There's also a great resource that the North Carolina it's called Desire. I think it's University of North Carolina. No, North Carolina Solar Energy. Shoot, I forgot the name of the organization that manages it, but it's called Desire, which is the database of state incentives for renewable energy. So it's not just microgrids, but it really tries to be a comprehensive database for what's going on in all the different states.
Is a follow-up question from the person who asked about the bottom-up approach. The question says, reason I asked about the bottom-up approach, we are building synergistic cooperatives through Gigs Go Green for the primary benefit of Uber Lyft's drivers. And we are looking to build a regen village as a greenfield development, which we are wanting to incorporate a microgrid strategy within. Where would be the best place for us to seek technical assistance here in Colorado for our bottom-up approach?
I need to understand a little bit more about what they're actually thinking here.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't quite get how it relates to Uber or Lyft drivers.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds like needs a conversation to answer that question.
Okay, this is Jason Junker is the person who submitted this, and
yeah, so send me an email. My email was it's just cleanpowereverywhere@gmail.com.
okay. Once again, it's clean power everywhere.
Yes.
All one word at gmail.com.
Right.
Super.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. A comment from Representative Junie Joseph. Thank you for this informative presentation. So you've got some important
Oh, thank you.
People
well,
here.
well,
Yes.
you're welcome, or thank you for saying that.
Yeah. And let's see. Another question for the general single-family homeowners citizenry. What is your general comment on whether it is helpful for the eventual configuration of neighborhood-scale microgrids and the overall grid to use bidirectional vehicles where the vehicle powers the house in an outage? Or is it too early for such vehicles to be widely adopted?
I think that's a great concept. It probably is a little early. I don't know, too early. I'd like to see that start to happen soon. The irony of that, I totally think that's the future. But how quickly we get there, quicker the better. But I don't know. But here's the irony: is that idea was first promoted by a professor at the University of Delaware, Willett Kempton, 25 years ago or more, maybe. No, approximately 25 years ago. And I happened to bump into him recently. Shoot, I can't remember where, but recently, and I said something to him about, aren't you encouraged to see people talking about vehicle to grid now? And he goes, well, finally, because he was pushing, and it's 25 years ago, but technology adoption is sort of an interesting big topic, but how you get new technology adopted. Some things happen real fast, like the iPhone. This one requires both the car companies being on board, the utility companies have to have means the regulators need to be involved because you got to get compensated for this, and it's yeah, I don't know, it's not happening as quick as we might like, but it's a great idea.
Thank you. Here's one from Alan Best of Big Pivots. I noticed that Southeast Colorado has the highest number of interruptions in power interruptions, but it was not among the priority areas that you showed in the slide. Any thoughts about that? The background question has to do with the difficulty in doing microgrids in low population areas. And related question is are most rural areas, do they mostly get power from electric co-op? Oh, and related, as most rural areas get power from electrical cooperatives. Any thoughts about the role of RUS, rural
rural utility systems?
In creating microgrids.
Yeah, well, part of the Southeast Colorado was a priority area, and I don't know why the easternmost part wasn't. I don't know the answer to that. What was the other question? But low population areas actually are the best case scenario for it. Great presentation from somebody from Chattanooga, which I think that's a municipal utility, but they had a rural area that had really bad reliability, and the utility built a microgrid out there, and I was real impressed by that, actually. As far as co-ops go, I mean, there's 3,000 utilities in the U.S. And most of them are these small co-ops and a bunch of small munis. There's a couple like Los Angeles big munis, but a lot of these small utilities really don't have the technical resources to be innovative. The ones but they have organizationally, they are capable because they're theoretically managed by the customers. So typically they just have, that doesn't, so if you had some motivated individuals in that cooperative, they could, take over the board and really do stuff. But typically that's not typically what happens, but there are a few co-ops that are, and I wish I could give an example. I think Holy Cross in Aspen, I think that's a co-op, is a real, leader. And Kit Carson in New Mexico. So I think there's a lot of potential there, but it requires the members, the customers, to coalesce and make it happen. And there's a national organization, the National NRECA, National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, who could help. The PUC doesn't get involved with the co-op, so you can't go through the PUC really. But maybe you don't want to. Maybe you can do things faster if you don't have to go through anyway. I think co-ops have a lot of potential, but they're small and diverse, and it all depends who's there.
Okay, thank you. Another question, as you know, Boulder has tried off and on for a number of years to first to get its own utility and a number of attempts to get more renewable energy here. Is there a possibility for Boulder just to set up some microgrids, either at the neighborhood level or the critical infrastructure level, or even at the whole community level, and just have Boulder be a microgrid?
Well, there's absolutely potential to do microgrids at critical facilities, like the water treatment facility and the police station and whatnot. And absolutely. And that's, I think, it's starting to happen. Things move slower than we'd like them to, but Boulder and city as a whole is kind of big to think of as a microgrid. To be able to back up the entire city, and the city we don't lose power for the whole city at once, because as that map showed, there's multiple substations and multiple connections, and you can loop power around, and a neighborhood will lose power, or it's I wouldn't think of the whole city as a microgrid. That's not the right way to think about microgrids. And this community microgrid topic, you've got to deal with the right of way issue, and you sort of become your that if we had municipalized, I still wouldn't consider that a microgrid, but it would the community microgrid concept, it's attractive in a lot of ways, but it raises all these legal and regulatory issues that are just still outstanding, and so it's not something I feel like, well, let's just do that, because it's got all these legal issues.
Okay, thank you. Here's a question from RJ Harrington. He cites the law, and I'm assuming it's the law that that initiated this study. The law says the on or before January 1st, 2030. Should we take that to mean that the roadmap or the route map doesn't have to include signage until the latest, until 2030 at the latest? Do you have a sense of that?
I have no idea. I don't know. I don't know. Yeah.
Okay. Here's just a comment from Tracy Burnett. She says that at the initial presentation, I asked the Colorado Energy Office to add virtual power plants to the final roadmap.
Yeah, I mean they're different, but there's a lot. There's a lot of interest in, and there's some companies doing this. AutoGrid is one, and the company I'm starting to work with, True Current, I mentioned, putting in microgrids at fleet electrification places. A virtual power plant is dispersed distributed generation facilities that can be managed as a single unit. So if they're transacting with the utility company doesn't have to interact with each individual one, which they don't want to do, because that's just too, that makes it simpler for the utility to interact with the aggregator, and that's the virtual power plant, and then they manage multiple generators. So it's like a wholesaler, I suppose, or an aggregator, and there's a lot of interest in that, and that's
great. Thank you. And we have a comment and a question from our Boulder City Council person, Nicole Spear. She said, Colorado's status as having the highest cost per capita of disaster impacts was surprising. Is there a way of knowing how much power losses or damage to power systems contributed to these disaster-related costs, and whether that is different from other states? And parenthetically, thank you so much for this presentation. This is all very helpful information.
Well, I was surprised by that as well. So I haven't gotten past I'm surprised to actually drill into why that is. We were in the highest category. The roadmap itself has it lists the top 20 states, and we're not the top state, but we were the darkest color in the map. So I think I forgot, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and Iowa were worse, and maybe Alaska and Hawaii. I don't remember. I don't. I'm curious as well about that. I was very surprised myself.
Thank you. We have just a couple minutes left, and I know you, Peter, you have a hard stop at 7 o'clock. So here's one from James Gilbert. This seems to have some overlap with the CETA transmission study. However, the microgrid roadmap has not been cited specifically. There seems some potential to relieve congestion and plan for perhaps for leveraging microgrids in the CETA study to save some money/time. Is there some plan to dovetail these?
That's great. That's a really great point. And I wish I had made it in my presentation, that that a lot of the plans for, and I can go a little past 7 actually.
Okay.
A lot of the plans for how we're going to get to our carbon reduction goals involve, lots of renewables, obviously, and focus. And the cheapest way to do renewables is big wind farms in Wyoming or big solar parks in the sunniest places. That requires a lot of new transmission, and so there's a lot of attention. And actually, the roadmap had a section about new transmission, which I didn't quite think was relevant, really. Well, but it could be relevant in the way that question was brought up in this respect. I think microgrids in particular, and distributed generation more broadly, complements these transmission upgrades because they can be done more quickly and they don't need the transmission upgrade. So while we're trying to get the permitting, getting a transmission line permitted and built takes forever. And there's lots of efforts to streamline that process. And I think that would be great. I don't think it'll ever be quick. It should be quicker than it is now. But in the meantime, we can be doing distributed generation. Microgrids are the most secure way to do distributed generation, and we can move faster, and we can get more done, and we don't have to wait for the transmission lines to be built. So I don't really have an answer for the specific question. Working in both, and why isn't there more coordination between those two studies? Except that I think there should be, or there should be somebody, this needs to be a joint planning process that is transmission and microgrids. We need both, and yeah.
Yeah, and James is also interested to see if there was someone who had actually participated in both studies, and it sounds like that's what you're advocating.
I am advocating,
liaison.
And I can't say that there wasn't one. I just don't know.
Yeah, super. So I know you've generously agreed to stay a little beyond 7 o'clock. Normally, I would pass this over to Mary for some closing remarks because we like to end on the hour. But if you
I can read Wade's last question because I can answer it quickly. That I'm not the right person to ask that question for.
Okay.
But someone at the Colorado Energy Office probably is. I'm guessing.
Good. So thank you again very, very much. I think it's at 7, and I'll pass this back over to Mary, who will give us some previews of coming attractions. But again, on behalf of everybody here, Peter, thank you very much. This has been extremely helpful.
Okay. Yeah, my pleasure.
Before you go, Mary, I just wanted to say it sounds like it'd be possible to continue with a few questions after your wrap up, Mary. So, Peter, if you hang on, I think there could be a couple more questions. And
okay, sure.
Love your responses. Thank you.
Okay, great. Again, I also wanted to thank you, Peter, for your time this evening. And again, direct everybody to the Colorado Energy Office link that will show up on the next slide, because that's where you can sign up to participate in those community input sessions and read the original roadmap if you would like. I also want to take a moment to thank the other members of the Empower Our Future communications team. These folks are integral to making these Empower Hours happen. They are Paul Cullen, Chris Hoffman, Steve Whitaker, and Julie Zonizer. Thank you for joining us, and I'll turn it back to Peter. Thank you.
Yeah, and I want to thank Brian Hannigan for, I mentioned Holy Cross Energy. They are doing a microgrid in Aspen. And I did say Holy Cross Energy is a real leader in this. And then I'm just looking at the other questions. Julie asked microgrids in Boulder for critical facilities. Absolutely. But we have to need to identify them. Some of them are kind of obvious, I think. And then Steve asked, would it be a good solution to the PSPS? That's the Public Safety Preventative Shutoff events. Absolutely. I tried to distinguish between microgrids and virtual power plants. A virtual power plant can be an aggregation of microgrids or aggregation of anything really of power projects. So a microgrid is one thing, and a virtual power plant is a bunch of small things that get managed from the utilities side as a single thing. Yeah. Well, that's it, I guess. And it looks like most people stuck around. That's great. And I appreciate your interest because I've been promoting microgrids for 30 years, and I think they have an enormous potential.
Peter, this is Julie interrupting again. I'm sorry. I don't know. Did you get a chance to see in the Q&A? Maybe you answered this and I missed it. The question from Wade Lockhart down in St. Louis Valley. He had a question.
Yeah, he wanted to know where he could look for funding, and I don't know the answer to that. There is a bunch of funding available, between the infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act, and there's state of Colorado has a little bit of money itself for rural communities to plan microgrids. And the guy at the Colorado Energy Office, whose name escapes me, but his name is all over the website. Shoot, I can't. The guy in charge of that is also the guy in charge of this rural program, which is mostly for planning, I think, but that's the first step, right?
Thanks a lot, Peter. It's been very interesting, and people will hopefully, if they have some questions that they were thinking about when you answered yours, it might be that they'll give that feedback to the ideas of coordinating some of this planning and other things that people brought up. They can give that feedback to the I think we had that link available. That would be to the meetings that are the stakeholder meetings.
Yeah, I was sharing that. I can put it back up for a sec. That upper link has so anyway, I'm going to sign off.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yep, you're welcome. Talk to you soon, Julie.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
Yeah, bye.